Hey there folks, John here, and one of the things that I get asked for the most is to recommend games to people that are either rare or obscure, or maybe they came out in a different region, or whatever the reason, they're games that just don't get a lot of attention and not a lot of people talk about. And this is the first video in a new series that I wanted to start that takes a bit of a deeper dive into some of those games. And it's something I've been wanting to do for a while, so like I said, this is the first one, and what brought it about, what kind of made me decide that this was the time to do it, was the fact that Nintendo just recently released 6 new games on their online service for the first time in months. And we got some really good ones in there, like Kirby Superstar, and obviously Star Fox 2 was a big one. And then we also got a few NES games as well, and one of those NES games is a little sci-fi game called Journey to Silius, and I found that not a lot of people know a whole lot about this game, and it's actually got a really fascinating history. So in this first video in this series, which I'm going to be calling Bitmaps from here on, we're going to take a look at Journey to Silius and how it came to be, because it's actually got a really interesting history. So here we go. So like I said, this is Journey to Silius, and this game was created in 1990, and it is actually a Sunsoft game, but it wasn't developed by them. It was actually developed by a company called Tokai Engineering. I think I pronounced that right. But basically it was a subsidiary of the Sunsoft brand, and interestingly enough, it's also the same company, same development house that developed Blaster Master as well. And, you know, if for anybody that knows Blaster Master, that's a much better known game than Journey to Silius. So Blaster Master, you know, is a wonderful game. Most people know about it. I think it's been available on the Nintendo Shop or Nintendo Online service for a while. And, you know, it's a great game, great music, everything else. Not a lot needs to be said about Blaster Master. I feel like it's been covered pretty well. But Journey to Silius, on the other hand, there's not a lot that's been said about this thing. And this is actually a really great game. And if you're into the speedrun community on the NES, this one's actually fairly well known, just because it's a really fun run to do. It's not an easy game. It's actually pretty hard. So interesting thing about this game, this was actually originally supposed to be the Terminator game for the NES. Now, unfortunately, this is the greatest probably NES licensed game that is not actually licensed, because Sunsoft took too long to make it, and they lost the license halfway through, after the game was already pretty much developed and almost done. And you can actually see some remnants of the Terminator-ness in the game, in some of the enemies, like that one. And also even the final boss, which looks like exactly like the T-100 exoskeleton from the movie. Like, it looks like spot on. It's pretty clear that this was meant to be the Terminator game for the NES. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at this.
If a major motion picture was ever made to be a video game, it has to be The Terminator. In fact, when you really look at it, it's a video game of sorts already, with human heroes pitted against a monstrous mechanical enemy, a nail-biting plotline, and a non-stop manic chase through every part of the city. And of course, the explosive arsenal of video and audio effects that made The Terminator the action hit of the 80s. All that's missing is a way to translate the movie's incredible audio-visual action to the small screen, and a way to control it, which is exactly what the software pioneers at Sunsoft have done.
You know, when I started this video, I kind of figured I would end up talking a little bit about the gameplay, a little bit about the story, maybe a little bit about the history, the fact that it used to be a Terminator video game, and that's really about it. But the more I've dug into the story of Journey to Silius, the more interesting stuff I've found. And one of the best things that I've found is actually an article over on a site called Gaming Alexandria, and I will I'll leave that link in the description below, and I'll actually put it on a lower third right now just so you guys can see where it's at. Where a guy who on Twitter he goes by the history of Sunsoft, and again I'll put a link in a lower third to his Twitter account. You should definitely go follow him. Posted a video from an industry trade show back then from before Sunsoft lost that license that actually shows kind of the direction that this game was going in prior to losing that license. And I think it's just an absolutely fascinating piece of history that when stuff like this shows up, which is pretty rare. I mean, you don't really get like inside looks at like old game footage like this anymore, really. It's just super interesting and super cool. So I wanted to shine a spotlight on it. I'm going to show a couple clips from it here.
With scenes based largely on actual movie footage and graphics that set a new standard for Nintendo software. And that's not all the Terminators got. Want constantly moving multiple screens? You got them. Room-rattling sound effects? You got them. In fact, when you add it all up, you'll see that the Terminator has bestseller written all over it.
Pretty cool stuff, and you can see this game actually was gonna go in a little bit of a different direction, I think, before all of the different stuff happened and they lost the license and everything else. So you can actually see cutscenes that are like direct taken from the movie that are kind of like those opening cutscenes that I showed a little earlier, but with animation and like it just looks really cool, right? And going back to that Terminator thing, I did just want to show there's actually a Nintendo Power ad that shows this game as being in development as the Terminator game, and I think that's really interesting, and I love seeing stuff like that because we can kind of see what this thing looked like before they lost that license, which is basically the same. The character sprite's a little different, but other than that, it's basically the same, and it's got that Terminator logo on there, which is pretty cool. That said, it didn't end up being the Terminator game. They ended up having to rebrand it as a totally new IP, and it's kind of a mashup of every like 90s sci-fi genre trope you could possibly imagine. And the story is actually pretty generic. You play a kid named Jay McRae as he travels to the Silius planet or a space station, and basically once you get there you have to fight off all of these terrorists that have killed everybody on the space station. And so this teenager has to go through and just defeat this gigantic robot army and liberate the space station. And that's kind of the story. It doesn't really make a whole ton of sense, but you know what? It works for an NES game, right? And NES games don't have to make sense. So moving on past the story, this is a run and gun platformer. Sort of, kind of has a Mega Man vibe to it. Then, there's a lot of those on the NES, right? If it was just that it was just a platform where you go and you shoot robots and, that sort of thing, it wouldn't really stand out all that much. But for some reason, they were able to kind of nail this formula where the gameplay is just really, really tight. Really, it's just a really well-crafted game, even though it's extremely hard. It's going to take you a while to beat this one, but it is totally, totally, totally worth it. And the bosses in it take quite a bit of practice to get used to. It doesn't hold your hand. You do get different weapons. After you beat a mini boss at the end of each stage, you get a weapon that you can then use on the boss of that stage and then onward. It took me about, I don't know, probably 4 hours to beat the first time I played through, and it's only 5 levels. But it is just a fantastic game if you haven't played it. And, since it's available on the Nintendo Online service, it's totally worth picking up. It's totally worth playing and checking out for yourself. Now, one of the things that is worth noting about that lost Terminator license, and if you're an NES connoisseur, you may know this, is there is actually another Terminator game for the NES. So after Sunsoft lost that license, somehow that license got given to a company called Radical Entertainment. And you may not have heard of them. They weren't a huge developer on the NES, but they did have a pretty storied history going through and developing different things. One of the later games that they actually did for the NES is Mario is Missing. This is an edutainment game where you play as Luigi, and everybody was really excited to play as Luigi because it was a game where you couldn't play as Mario. And I remember renting this and finding out that it's an edutainment game. You go around and you answer questions about like history and stuff. And it's fine for that, I guess, but it's not what it's marketed as. So, really interesting thing. That was one of their later games that they ended up developing. But prior to that, they ended up getting this Terminator license. Oh, and it's worth noting too, they had only done one game prior to developing this other Terminator game, and that was an adaptation of The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. And if you are an NES connoisseur, I wouldn't blame you even if you really know a lot about NES stuff if you've never played The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. So let me just give you a little bit of gameplay footage just to give you an idea of the kind of thing we're looking at. And yeah, so not that great. So these guys somehow got the license that Sunsoft had held and had pretty much developed an entire full game for, to then go and develop an entirely new Terminator game. And it didn't turn out that great. There is a little bit of footage here, and I'm kind of showing that now, but you can see it's like it's a far cry from Journey to Silius. The sprite work, not nearly as good. It's kind of just a little bit of a mess, really. And so it's a shame that this license got transferred away from this game and went over there to that one. And actually, the Terminator license didn't have a great history on the NES anyway, because there was a T2 Judgment Day game, Terminator 2, and it didn't fare much better because some way, somehow, that license was transferred to a little company that you may be familiar with, and their name is LJN. And if you know your NES games, if you've been around this for a while, you probably know LJN is responsible for just about every crappy movie or TV show licensed game on the NES. They made just horrible adaptations of things, and I got a couple right here. If you've ever played Back to the Future or X-Men on the NES, you know what I'm talking about with these. Like, the music in Back to the Future and the gameplay is just absolutely atrocious, and X-Men's kind of like a gauntlet that just doesn't really work. But yeah, I mean, especially Back to the Future, I mean, just take a look. Yeah, let's go back to Journey to Silius. One of the best things about this game is the music. And it's a unique game when it comes to the NES because the music was composed differently than just about every other NES game. Most of the time when they would develop an NES game, it was all predetermined sounds that the NES could make, and you kind of had to make those work regardless of what game you were making or what game you were developing. The interesting thing about this one is that the composer, whose name was Naoki Kodaka, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to butcher that pronunciation, so if you actually know what that is, I do apologize. But anyways, the music was developed, and instead of using just the NES's normal sounds for the bass track, he actually sampled outside sounds and brought them into the game and digitized them and used those for the music, and it really shows through in the music. And I'm just gonna let the opening title theme play here for just a minute, just so you guys can see what I'm talking about. But it is good. So here we go. See what I mean? It's really good music, and it really stands out among NES soundtracks as something that's just like totally different, and something that you wouldn't normally hear on the NES. And it's just beyond just the instrumentation, the compositions are actually really good as well. All the music is really driving, and it just works. It just works real well. Now, as far as regional differences are concerned, I have played the U.S. version of the game since I am in the U.S. There are a couple little differences in the European or Japanese one. In the Japanese one, the game's actually not called Journey to Silius. It's called Rough World, which to me is kind of a generic name for such a game that has such a recognizable footprint. But it's interesting, and the logo is kind of an interesting logo as well, which I'll flash up right now. But it's called Rough World in Japan, and the only other real difference is in the character sprite. In the Japanese version and the European version, he's wearing a helmet, and in the US you can see his face. I don't know why that is. I'm sure that had something to do with marketing back in the day and what they thought the American people would like. But anyway, so those are the only real differences. And if you're interested in kind of trying to see what the game would look like if it were a Terminator licensed game, somebody has actually worked on a hack to try to kind of transform it back into Terminator, which I think is pretty cool. So again, I just wanted to give a huge shout out and a huge thanks to both Gaming Alexandria and the History of Sunsoft, and all the other sources, which by the way, I'll put them in the description down below, that I used in kind of getting all the facts together for this game, because it's been an absolutely fantastic and just fascinating experience. And if you guys like this kind of video, please let me know in the comments. And this is the kind of content that I really would love to keep doing on YouTube. The pickup videos and the repair stuff is all fun, and I like doing it. But these are the kind of videos that I watch, if you know what I mean. Like, I like watching Slope's Game Room and Stop Skeletons from Fighting, and the shows that go into the history, right, of the games, and not only the history, but how people feel about them, what their personal experiences with them are. And so this is something that I want to keep doing more in the future. I've actually had to re-record this video 3 or 4 times, just because I keep finding new pieces of information to add to this story. Because like I said, originally, this was really just me gonna get on camera and talk about how I love Journey to Silius, and just think it's an amazing game. And it ended up turning into so much more, and I'd like to do this again. So, like, comment, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff, and I will see you guys next time.
So don't wait. Put the record-breaking popularity and breakthrough motion picture graphics of the Terminator to work for you today. And keep watching for more of the biggest and best new titles in home video game software from, who else? Sunsoft, the title holder.